Hi, everyone. My name's Derek Pratt. I'm the educator and interim curator at the Erie Canal Museum in downtown Syracuse. I want to begin by acknowledging, with respect to the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the Indigenous people whose ancestral lands the Erie Canal Museum now stands on. I'm so grateful that so many of you have chosen to join us today as we look at this important topic. The Haudenosaunee perspective is a glaring example of a viewpoint that has traditionally been excluded from discussions about the Erie Canal's impacts, even though they were living on this land long before the canal came through. Had their way of life radically disrupted by the canal's construction and operation, and still continue to thrive alongside its banks today. We hope that through this program and the rest of our series, looking largely at Indigenous foodways, which we will be conducting as part of this project in partnership with the Scano Great Law of Peace Center, to really get our audience thinking much more critically about how the Haudenosaunee and the Erie Canal interacted, as well as how this history is not just about the past, but also plays an important role in our present and future. We'll be exploring the impact of the Erie Canal on the Haudenosaunee several more times this year, largely as part of the Erie Eats Erie Canal Foodways project, which is funded in part through the generous support of the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor and the William G. Pomeroy Foundation. Before I hand over the introductions to Sarah Shute from Scano, I'd like to tell you quickly about a couple of programs we have coming up. You can find more details about our programs on our website, eriecanalmuseum.org/events. Next Saturday, April 3rd, we're hosting our first in a series of talks presented by master gardeners with the Cornell Cooperative Extension. This one will be all about historic herbs and herb gardening. And then we're hosting a lunchtime lecture on Thursday, April 22nd, titled Converging on the Canal, the 19th Century Through Food. All of these events are, of course, virtual for now. We plan to start offering some in-person outdoor programs soon. Thank you again for joining us. And now I'd like to turn it over to Sarah Shute, Director of the Scano Great Law of Peace Center. Take it away.
Thank you, Derek. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Really excited and really looking forward to our talk this morning. I also want to take a moment to recognize the American Indian Law Alliance, who is another generous sponsor of this series that we're beginning today. ALA is an organization that fights for human rights, social justice, and sovereignty for Indigenous peoples all over the world, and also advocates on behalf of the rights of Mother Earth. Thank you, Derek, for initiating the partnership between the Erie Canal Museum and the Scano Center. And Derek was really looking for a way to expand our understanding of the impacts of the Erie Canal, specifically the impacts of the canal on the Haudenosaunee, the Indigenous people who have been living on these lands for thousands of years. So I am the director of the Scano Great Law of Peace Center, and we are an incredibly beautiful and important Haudenosaunee Cultural Heritage Center. We share a powerful message about restoring balance in oneself, in our society, and with the earth. We share the history, culture, values, and contributions of the Haudenosaunee, and we do it in an oral history fashion from the Haudenosaunee perspective. Our center is located on the shore of Onondaga Lake, near what is now known as Syracuse, New York. Onondaga Lake is sacred to the Haudenosaunee, and I'm sure our speakers today will be sharing more about that with you in just a moment. Both Phil and Jake are on what we call the Academic Collaborative at the Scano Center, which is essentially an advisory or a steering committee made up of members and leaders from the Onondaga Nation, as well as local colleges and universities. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you this morning, Jake Hiwagai Edwards, the Onondaga Eel Clan. He lives on Onondaga Nation territory and maintains the continuity of the Longhouse oral teachings, which are over 1,000 years old. Jake is the 11th child in a family of 12 children, and he grew up among his elders of the Onondaga Nation, learning and sharing the messages from the original instructions and passing on history and knowledge of the natural world. Jake was appointed by the Grand Council of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to the Haudenosaunee External Relations Committee to respectfully work on political and governmental structures beyond the borders of Haudenosaunee country. This work includes diplomatic work at the United Nations and other entities outside the Confederacy. He is a board member of the 7th Generation of Indigenous Peoples and a board member of the Indigenous Values Initiative. In 2013, Jake was one of the primary voices leading the 400th anniversary of the Two-Row Wampum campaign, in which people in canoes paddled the waterways from the Onondaga Nation territory to the United Nations in New York City, teaching people at stops along the way. He actively reminds people of the significance of our treaties and reflects upon decisions that will protect the people into the 7th generation. Jake explains how wampum laid the foundational principles and structures of the United States Constitution. We also have with us Dr. Phil Arnold. Phil is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Religion at Syracuse University, as well as a core faculty member of Native American and Indigenous Studies. He was the founding director of the Scano Great Law of Peace Center and is still very actively involved in guiding the center today. He has written several books, including Sacred Landscapes and Cultural Politics, Planting a Tree, The Gift of Sports, Indigenous Ceremonial Dimensions of the Games We Love, and Urgency of Indigenous Religions. He is a member of the Neighbors of Onondaga Nation, which is a fantastic ally organization of the Syracuse Peace Council. In 2007, he organized the Doctrine of Discovery Study Group to discuss the legacy of Christianity in the destruction of Indigenous peoples. He is the president of the Indigenous Values Initiative, which is a nonprofit organization that supports the work of the Scano Great Law Peace Center and other organizations and initiatives to educate the general public about the Indigenous values of the Haudenosaunee. So thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today, and thank you to all of the folks joining us from all over. Jake, I will turn it over to you now.
Mother Earth. We're all put our minds together as one and at peace, that we'll all work for Mother Earth, that she can still provide for us, for the future, for today and into the future, even if it's just for one more day, that we will be of great gratitude that all that she does and all that Creator has put here for us to carry on to help us live in peace and contentment as we walk about on Mother Earth for today. And so we put our minds together as one, and we bundle our thoughts and our gratitude in one bundle and give a great gratitude that what was put here for us to survive in peace and contentment on Mother Earth is still here and still going on. So we'll let it be that way in our minds. And so this was a short version of the Ganohanyo, the words before all else, sometimes referred to. It's an opening combination of our gratitude and our being of one mind of thankfulness for all things that were put here for us to survive on this earth and our time here on earth, as we are left to prepare for the next generations coming, the goodness and bounties that we received while we're here. And so we kindly and respectfully put our minds together as one and give a great gratitude that these things, including the animal beings, the four-leggeds, the winged animals, and the water animals, that they're all still here doing their duties and responsibilities, as we are too as well, looking out so that the future generations and human beings and animal beings and medicine beings and all that's mentioned will be here for the future generations to come. As I mentioned, this is a short version of the Thanksgiving address, as it's referred to at sometimes too. And sometimes this address can go for hour and a half, 2 hours, depending on the speaker and the detail that he puts in there in his words that we all gather in our minds and in our hearts and in our bodies as one and give a great gratitude of peace and contentment to walk about here on Mother Earth. And so this one here is the short version of it, and we do our openings this way. It's called the opening address of gratitude. And we kindly and respectfully put our minds together as one and give a great gratitude that all these beings and all these medicines and all the waters and the streams and the sun and the moon and the stars and the clouds and the winds and the thunders are all still doing their duties with their instructions so that we as human beings here can be at peace and content as we walk about. And so with that, we can say this discussion is open. So we carry on with the Hondashony and the territory that the Erie Canal that we're talking of travels through, or we're going to start with a presentation from Phil. I'm not sure exactly how we're going to do this, but we can begin.
We can start. I can start, Jake, with a PowerPoint, and then you can come in after. That's what we've done before. But
okay,
up to you.
All right.
Okay. I am going to share the screen. Hello, everyone. I have to wear my SU hat today. It's very important in case anyone of my colleagues is looking in, but you know, every little bit helps. So I just wanted to thank the Erie Canal Museum, Derek Pratt, and the Scano Great Law Peace Center, Sarah Shute, for pulling this all together. We have done this talk at various places along the canal already. And it seems to us that people really want to hear this message. Usually the message of the canal is one of kind of a celebration. And I think we wanted to really intervene in that kind of triumphal history from Indigenous and Haudenosaunee perspective. So, so this is the image that was sent to you that promoted this talk today. And I just want to point out that there's a lot of trauma already present in the image. We already know that. We have the Phragmites, this invasive species. It's a beautiful kind of plant, but it's still invading the ecosystem. And there are people on this call, I know, who could speak much more about that than I can. Also, it's good to be mindful that the Onondaga Lake has undergone some extreme challenges. It's currently being beautified. And in this sunset picture, you can see the amphitheater across the lake from the Scano Center, but that covers up an enormous waste bed. So we've got lots of challenges yet at Onondaga Lake. It'll still remain a Superfund site into the foreseeable future. So right there, we're talking about trauma. And I mean, there's a legacy of this, and I want to try to contextualize it a little bit for you all from my point of view anyway. All right, so yes, next slide. Okay, so I'm not sure if you can see this. This composite comes from an NEH grant that we did with Rachel May and Jane Reed at SU from 2015 called Onondaga Lake, Finding a Restorative Center in Digital Space. And this brief video was really just a series of images from a drone footage that really Rachel pieced together. I want to just play it for you now, give you some sense of the scope of the magnitude of the devastation. So even without talking about the Great Law of Peace and what happened here over 1,000 years ago, you can see that Onondaga Lake was an incredibly rich, what we call resource area, but it's much more than that. It's a place of healing. Previous to 1700, right here, we've reconstructed it from maps from 1780. And there were all kinds of healing springs at Onondaga Lake. We know about the salt springs, but there's also, sulfur springs and hot springs and a variety of other things, even chlorine springs. So there are a lot of resources here for healing. It's a healing place previous to the Erie Canal. This is a reconstruction from about 1860, and you can see where the original Erie Canal and the Oswego Canal are on either side of Onondaga Lake. So Onondaga Lake then becomes a kind of water reservoir for the canals in the area. And this kind of emphasizes the level of destruction that occurred during the early 19th century. And this is the same place today. You can see Destiny Mall here. That's a few years ago. That's been, there have been some other buildings that have been gone up since then. So I just give you that as a sort of a sense of things. And so this is our title slide. Sarah already introduced us to this, but this is an image of the peacemaker coming in the white stone canoe into Onondaga Lake. It was done by Brandon Lazor, really commemorating and celebrating the Scano Great Law of Peace Center. I wanted to show that to you today. So I want to elaborate a little more on the Scano Great Law of Peace Center. This is my wife, Sandy Bigtree, and I with Charles H. Long at the Scano Center. He visited the center. He was a renowned historian of religion, really a kind of grandfather of my field in the academic study of religion. And we were fortunate enough to be able to show him the Scano Center in 2018. He passed away last year in 2020, and I wanted to acknowledge him and his contributions really to the creation of the center. So originally it was built as a Jesuit fortified mission at Onondaga Lake in 1656 to 1658. They were only here 20 months, the Jesuits, trying to really convert and colonize the Onondaga. They were sent by the French colonial government in Montreal and arrived with a grant, a title to approximately 600 square miles of Onondaga territory even before they arrived. And I want to talk about that in some more detail because this is an example of the doctrine of discovery. The first French fort was built in 1933, and it's been iconic in Syracuse. In the 70s, the fort was rebuilt to more appropriately reflect a French colonial fort. And in the 80s, it was called the Sainte Marie among the Iroquois. It was expanded in the 90s, became a living museum of French colonists that depicted French life in the fort from the 1650s. But always the Haudenosaunee culture is seen through the Jesuit perspective. And it closed in 2011. And then starting in 2012, I, as the founding director, along with Sandy and others from a wide variety of institutions, there are a number of people still involved with the Scano Center, worked with the Onondaga Nation to bring their narrative back to Onondaga Lake. And then we opened in November of 2015. So this is the collaborative that put together the narrative at the Scano Center. The Onondaga Nation, it's an Onondaga County facility. It's managed by Onondaga Historical Association, Syracuse University, Lemoyne, Onondaga, OCC, ESF, Empire State, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and the Indigenous Values Initiative have all been involved in forming and supporting the Scano Center. And the one thing I want to say is I hope many of you get to visit the Scano Center as well as the Erie Canal Museum here in Syracuse because they are really terrific places to visit. So the Haudenosaunee people, or means people of the Longhouse, are often referred to by their colonized name of the Iroquois, which is largely seen as a negative term. There's a confederation of originally 5 and now 6 separate nations: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Tuscarora, and Seneca. In this belt, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor there? Okay, so in the belt that Jake will talk about in a while, that was created at least 1,000 years ago, probably well before that, at Onondaga Lake, and it depicts the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga with the central tree, the Cayuga, and the Seneca, and then the Tuscarora joined in the early 1700s. The influence of the Haudenosaunee was felt, this is recorded in early colonial documents, was felt from Nova Scotia to the Mississippi River Valley, from the Great Lakes to Georgia. Currently, the Onondaga Nation is among just a handful of sovereign traditional governments that are still recognized by the United States. They're not governed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs or the Interior Department, but by their ancient system, the Great Law of Peace, which was founded here at Onondaga Lake. That system inspired Western democracy, the women's movement, and lacrosse, among other things that we talk about at the Scano Center. This is a depiction of the Hondashonee's Great Seal. And generally speaking, so the Onondaga are the central fire of the Confederacy, and Grand Council meets at Onondaga on a regular basis. The 49 clan chiefs in Tadadaho are depicted by the 50 images that surround the Great Tree of Peace, the white roots of peace spreading in the 4 directions, and the weapons of war are cast into its roots. Clan animals surround the great tree with the eagle at the top of the tree. And it's really quite amazing these days to see so many eagles returning to Onondaga Lake. So they're the central fire of the Grand Council of the Confederacy, and largely that they often talk about 3 messages coming to the Haudenosaunee. We talk about these in different elements: creation, the Thanksgiving address that Jake has just opened us with. Then comes the Great Law of Peace, which culminates at the Onondaga Lake. It's this grand narrative, that goes on for at least a week and a half during the summer in some longhouse in different longhouses in different places. And then finally, the Gaiweo, or the Code of Handsome Lake, that came as a kind of series of visions to Handsome Lake in the early 1800s. And I wanted to mention too, the Thanksgiving address is regarded as a first instruction. It's kind of a rooting idea, and it's not a prayer. It's not worship. It's not a petition. It is an address. So, okay, so there are three ways to think of Onondaga Lake as culturally distinctive. First, as the founding place of the Hondashony. Recently, it's been suggested that based on oral tradition and also a full solar eclipse, that it's at least as old as 909 CE. And this is the grand story of the Tadadaho peacemaker and Hiawatha coming together at Onondaga Lake. This is a famous painting by the great Oren Lyons. Second, it's where there's first contact with Jesuit missionaries in 1656, as I mentioned, and we still have a fort. And then finally, third, it's the central stop of the Erie Canal. So beginning in 1823, really 1825, and I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, at the Scano Center, we talk about sort of 6 different values expressed through oral history of the Haudenosaunee. Scano, the Onondaga welcoming greeting, meaning peace and wellness. That's only obtained through proper relationship to the natural world and the beings of the natural world. The Thanksgiving address, or the words before all else. The creation story, how the natural world prepares the earth for human beings. Fourth, the Great Law of Peace, this story of the peacemaker, Jigonsase, Hiawatha, Tadadaho, as I said, established at Onondaga Lake over 1,000 years ago. Then we get to European contact, the Doctrine of Discovery, which I want to go into some more detail. The Jesuit missionary fort, the 2-row wampum, colonialism, Sullivan and Clinton campaign, George Washington's Canandaigua Treaty Belt, and boarding schools. All these things are just topics in and of themselves. I won't be able to get to all those. But then we also finish with the Haudenosaunee survival and their influences on American culture and society. Western democracy is inspired by this, the women's movement, lacrosse, environmental values, food, and the United Nations and work in the United Nations. That continues. I'm going to go through those very quickly. Scano, as we heard, Scano, Nyoenha Scano, is the welcoming greeting, meaning peace and wellness. So this is the first station, if you like, and you can hear, there you hear from Frida Jock, clan mother at Onondaga Nation. Thanksgiving address, which we just heard, this ancient protocol that would have been recited before meetings with the founding fathers, for example, at Philadelphia or Albany or wherever they happen to be meeting. So this is an ancient protocol that is always begins and ends meetings. Creation story or creation narrative. This has very important lessons in it. The Sky Woman, the First Woman, and the Creator Twins. I won't go through it because it's an elaborate story that needs its own treatment. But basically the value here is that the natural world prepares the place for human beings to live on what becomes Turtle Island, the Haudenosaunee name for North America. Then the Great Law of Peace, this epic narrative of the coming of the peacemaker, him encountering Jagonsase, condoling Hiawatha in the first process of raising him up out of his grief for the loss of his family. And then finally, all of them gathering together and through their songs and through their message, being able to transform the Tadadaho from this evil person into a kind of pillar of strength for the Haudenosaunee. So in that process, wampum and condolence are utilized together as a way of women selecting the chiefs and then raising male representatives into their life offices. So wampum and condolence then work together to form the leadership of the Hondashony through the matrilineal clan system. So if we had more time, I would go much more into this because it's really fundamental for Haudenosaunee leadership, and also their why it is important that the women lead in Haudenosaunee culture. Then we move on to European contact, and as I said, I want to talk about the Doctrine of Discovery because this is what really undergirds the Jesuit missionary fort and what follows. Okay. Beginning, I think most of us recognize this as a picture of a Columbus statue in Columbus Circle in downtown Syracuse, particularly difficult to deal with as Columbus stands atop the four disembodied heads of Native Americans. And he is facing west through the Catholic Church downtown, facing west in the west, sort of celebrating that idea of westward migration, which the Erie Canal makes possible. So there's been a lot of conversation around this statue lately, and we'll see what comes of it. But nevertheless, this narrative of Columbus was very important in 1933 when the Columbus statue went up. And I'm not going to go into much detail about that. My wife, Sandy, and I have written about that, and I can share links about that whole episode. But also the French fort went up in 1934, 33, around the same time anyway. And this was during a time when there was a rise in fascism and that sort of thing. So these kind of monuments were trying to actively change the narrative around these sorts of monuments. But beginning in 1452, that is the 15th century, a succession of Catholic popes gave Christians sanction to seize lands and goods and enslave non-Christian people. And this at first started in Africa, the west coast of Africa. These papal bulls, which are exclamations from the Vatican, went first to Portugal, the Portuguese emperors, and this is really the origin of the transatlantic slave trade, and issued in the Age of Discovery. We all know about the story of Columbus. So, in other words, Christianity is used as a weapon against indigenous peoples around the world, right? And this has been a challenge for indigenous peoples at the UN and other places. For example, in 1452, we're currently trying to translate these documents. Pope Nicholas V authorizes King Alfonso V of Portugal to, quote, invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans and reduce their persons to perpetual slavery and take away all their possessions and property. So in other words, their bodies, their possessions, their lands, everything was forfeit to the Christian empire. So this was, as I said, originally part of these raiding expeditions on the west coast of Africa. This is followed in 1493, 6 months after Columbus's discovery by Pope Alexander, the Borgia Pope, the sixth. He calls for barbarous nations to be subjugated and brought to the Catholic faith and Christian religion for the propagation of the Christian empire. So there's obviously a lot more to talk about here, but this is what we're talking about as the forerunner of the doctrine of discovery. Fast forward to 1823 and the Johnson v. McIntosh decision. The 200th anniversary of that decision is coming up, where Chief Justice John Marshall writes in the unanimous opinion that outlines the doctrine of discovery as fundamental to U.S. property law. So what's happening here? They're taking, this Protestant nation is taking these Catholic ideas and moving them into property law right before the canal begins, right around the beginning of the canal. Non-Indian U.S. federal Indian law borrows the dehumanizing doctrine of discovery by Christian people of land inhabited by natives who were considered heathens. This Catholic principle of discovery morphs into Protestant nation-building concept. So this is very important for me as someone interested in the role of religion in colonialism. This is really fundamental information. It's long, it's not, it's still a very active principle of law. The first citation in Sherrill v. Oneida Nation in 2005, quote, under the doctrine of discovery, fee title to the lands occupied by Indians when the colonists arrived became vested in the sovereign, first the discovering European nation and later the original states and the United States, right? And that decision is written by Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So what she's saying is that we cannot go against the doctrine of discovery because it complicates the presumption of clear title to land. So it's still very much an active principle. Beginning in 2009, however, with the U.S. Episcopal Church, there have been a series of repudiating documents by Christian denominations pushing back against the doctrine of discovery. In this repudiation, the Episcopalians are saying they're advocating for the U.S. adoption of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and to end the Cabot Charter, which predates the Episcopal Church, which began in the 1530s. It was also one of those documents like the Papal Bulls. So similar moves among Unitarians, Friends, United Methodists, Disciples of Christ. I think I have a slide here. So there's a whole list of repudiations of the doctrine of Christian discovery. So we're not just talking about crazy religion talk from, the 15th century. We're talking about stuff that's actually happening now. Now, it was under this rubric that the Jesuits were coming in the 17th century into Hondashony lands, into Onondaga Nation territory. And that's the important point here. So Indigenous Values Initiative have sponsored a series of Doctrine of Discovery conferences. The last one was in August of 20, if you want to look at some of those things. This image called Broken Treaties is also by Brandon Lazor. You can go to our website or our YouTube channel to watch some of those presentations. We also talk about the Sullivan-Clinton campaign, 1779, which again is a very long topic. We just did another panel discussion on that last fall. And that's also available on, I think, the Scano YouTube channel. In 1790, the U.S. federal government is really fundamental to understand the Erie Canal, created the Indian Non-Intercourse Act, in which it's only the federal government that can enter into treaty relationships between Native American nations and the United States, and not individual states. And this was fundamental for the United States to function as a coherent government. States were anxious to make their own deals with the Haudenosaunee and other Native nations, in the original colonies. But the United States, if it was to hold together as a United States, needed to make those agreements between sovereign nations. So all treaties between New York State and various Haudenosaunee people and communities after this act are illegal. And that's one of the issues around the Onondaga land rights claim in 2005. The Canandaigua Treaty comes soon after. I recommend the Treaty of Canandaigua, 1794, edited by Peter Jemison and Anna Shine. And these articles were to guarantee a long and fruitful relationship between the Haudenosaunee and the United States. That in Article 2, the United States acknowledges the lands reserved to the Oneida, Onondaga, and Cayuga nations in their respective treaties in the state of New York, and called their reservations to be their property, and the United States will never claim the same nor disturb them, or either of the six nations, in the free use and enjoyment thereof, but the said reservation shall remain theirs until they choose to sell the same to the people of the United States, who have the right to purchase. As I said, the root of American democracy is with the Haudenosaunee. This is a coin minted in 2010 that celebrates the Haudenosaunee influence on American democracy, which was formally acknowledged in 1988 by the Joint Resolution of Congress, as well as the women's rights movement and lacrosse. And we will talk about that. But now I want to talk more about the canal. And really following from this remarkable book by Laurence Hauptman, who I hope will be joining us in future talks, called The Conspiracy of Interests, the Iroquois Dispossession and the Rise of New York State. So in spite of their influence on the US founding fathers, there was a concerted effort to remove the Haudenosaunee from New York State, and the Erie Canal was one of the most effective ways to accomplish that end, although unsuccessful. The Erie Canal opened in 1825, and Jake has been kind of really opened my eyes many years ago when he referred to the canal as a dam that stretches across the entire state of New York. I'll let him talk about that. New York Governor Dewitt Clinton opened the canal by pouring waters into the canal in 1825, called Clinton's Ditch. Simon Dewitt was New York State Board of Canal Commissioners and New York State Surveyor General's Office from 1784 to the 1830s. He was responsible for the Holland Land Company, a cousin to Governor Clinton. And so all of these people early on were very interested in flipping Indian lands, turning them into property, and therefore needed to have white people move into these territories. To give you an idea, this is a chart published in Hauptman's book. It shows the population increases in different counties. For example, take Erie, for example, Erie County, where before 1814, evidently there were no people, which is impossible because that's Seneca homeland. So the people they're counting are white people moving into these lands, or settler colonial people, literally. And by 1855, there's over, 130,000, right? So just in a short span. So the idea was that the Erie Canal would increase the numbers of people flowing in to these territories, displacing and dispossessing the Haudenosaunee. So I have to mention, as a religion scholar, that right along the Erie Canal is also referred to as the burned over district. This is also referred to as the Second Great Awakening in American religion. And this is a visit of our religion department. We have a couple of faculty members here and grad students and former students and everyone visiting Palmyra for the Passion that happens every summer. It's going to be coming to an end, but this is where Joseph Smith received the messages of the Mormons or the Latter-day Saints near Palmyra, New York. Also, there are Millerites along the Erie Canal that transform themselves into Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witness. There's the Fox Sisters, a kind of spiritualism movement. There's the Shakers, the monastics, the Oneida community, which is a utopian community. But what I want, my main point here is that there are all these religious innovations along the canal, which indicates that the trauma was not only felt by the Haudenosaunee, because people don't create new religions if they're not feeling trauma, okay? They're feeling trauma. They come up with new ideas, new forms of spirituality, right? So the trauma of the canal was universally felt, not just for the Haudenosaunee, but for all people that were involved with it. My own family came out along the canal. I won't go into this because I'm over time. But anyway, I've been working on this for quite a long time. This is a family gravestone in Ogden, New York, right along the canal. All right. So for millennia, the Haudenosaunee have been navigating these waterways for hunting, fishing, trade, diplomacy, conflicts, etc. Since the 1820s, the Erie Canal transformed the natural landscape by rerouting waterways from north-south to east-west for the purpose of commerce and occupying lands out west. Water underwent a shift from an indigenous gift exchange economy to an immigrant monetary commercial economy. And the environmental destruction and erosion of social values gave rise to religious innovation and westward migration. The Great Law of Peace is a new story, or a new ancient story, of our creation as Americans, and moving away from that Columbus colonial doctrine of Christian discovery story, we need a more indigenous story that roots us in the land. The Haudenosaunee can be our guides, and also to promote Scano and the good mind. And I would suggest that our survival depends on it. Thank you.
Phil, thank you so much for sharing that presentation. Thank you for all the work that you do for the Scano Great Law of Peace Center. I encourage everyone to visit if you're able. We are open for normal hours, and you can visit our website at scanocenter.org. I'm going to turn it over now to Jake Edwards for his portion of the talk. If you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll do a little question and answer session when Jake is finished. Thank you so much.
Well, hello again, everyone. And Phil covered just about everything I would be saying. And so I thank you, Phil, for your presentation, and cut mine real short. It's got some good information there to share with the world of who we are. And one of the last pictures that you showed on your screen was Taradaho standing at Onondaga Lake holding the original wampum bell of the Haudenosaunee, which is over 1,000 years old. And because of its age, and it's still in good condition, but it's not fair for it to be handled on a regular basis. So it's only brought out during Grand Council meetings and certain events that call for it in our circle of Haudenosaunee people. The belt belongs to all of us. It's Onondaga Nation is the wampum keepers of the Haudenosaunee, of the Confederacy, of Iroquois, different names that we've been given. We are the people of the Longhouse. This is our house. And in our house, you notice through the center, there's a line that connects them all. That's the Erie Canal. No, I'm just kidding. That's not the Erie Canal. In our house, we have a fire for each nation. And like Phil had mentioned, from the east is the Mohawk Nation, the Oneida Nation, the Onondaga Nation, or the Tree of Pieces, Keepers of the Fire, Cayuga Nation, and the Seneca Nation. This is our home. These are our villages. And so as we look at this, we recognize it as a flag. Now you see the Haudenosaunee's flag flying all over. And where that comes from is part of what Phil's presentation mentioned too, that we help contribute to the world the game of lacrosse. And we do travel as independent of the United States on our own passports throughout the world. We've sent delegations at different places in the world on our own passport, starting somewhere in the 1920s, 1924 to Geneva, Switzerland, to the League of Nations to address some of the concerns our peoples have with the Canadian government and the American government on the treatment of our people and our lands and our waters and our forests and our animals at that time, which was all being depleted. And so we brought up some of the issues to the League of Nations through one of our Cayuga leaders, Tiskaha. It was in 1924. So as time goes on, we traveled back to the United Nations. Now it's the United Nations. We traveled back in 1977 with a delegation of Indigenous peoples, including Haudenosaunee. And we traveled on our own passport. I said, well, how are we going to get over there? We're not US citizens. We're not Canadian citizens. Well, we'll make one. So we did. We made our passport. It explains who we are. And we use it today, although after 9/11, the countries around the world, including the United States, especially the United States, got real strict on traveling. And they've always had a hard time recognizing us as separate nations, which brings us back to 1924 again. Calvin Coolidge, President of the United States, issued a Citizenship Act, granting citizenship to all Native Americans, all Indigenous peoples of America. All that applied, well, not many applied for it. There was a certain number of people hanging around the Fort Indians, is what they're called sometimes, standing around the fort waiting for handouts because everything else was taken from them, their livelihood. So they got dependent on these forts and trading posts that were set up. Well, in turn, the government looked at that and said not many are applying. So they turned around and made a blanket coverage that now all Indigenous people in America are U.S. citizens. The Citizenship Act of 1924. Well, we sent from here at Grand Council of Haudenosaunee, we sent a letter to Calvin Coolidge, paraphrasing it as thank you, but no thank you. We'll maintain who we are. We'll maintain our own citizenship of Onondaga Nation and Haudenosaunee. And the Hopi Nation also sent a letter similar. And those are the only two that I know of. There may be others, but we rejected the Citizenship Act because we just know that you can't have treaties with yourself. Although we know in order to be at peace with the natural world, you must first be at peace with yourself. So as a citizen of the United States cannot make a treaty with the United States government. So we refuse that because we have treaties that are today still in effect. And so to give a brief history along with what Phil had presented, which was a very good presentation, this became our flag. When the lacrosse team traveled overseas and other nations, the world games of lacrosse were being played in other nations, they all had their flags up there. And they came over to the Iroquois Nationals lacrosse team and said, "Where's your flag?" And our young men that play lacrosse said, "Well, we don't need a flag to tell who we know who we are. We don't need a flag to tell us that." So, well, that's good that you know who you are. That's real good. But the rest of the world don't know. And all them flags up there that you see are their countries of the world. And so they put their heads together to come up with a flag. And there was some real nice ideas shared at that time. Artists, renderings of an idea there, let's make a flag like this, and different items of recognition of who we are. And then someone came up and said, "Well, how about this one? This is who we are. This tells who we are, all the 5 nations." So they had someone make up a flag and poof, there they hung their flag up. And it's become that flag because we don't have a flag. Our representation of who we are is in our home. It's the depiction of that symbol that you saw through Phil Arnold's presentation of the Tree of Peace and all the clan systems around it on Turtle Island. That's who we are. And that was one of the ideas that was shared. Put that on the flag. That's who we are. Then you have to explain the whole flag and all the little animals. It was too much. You make it just simple. And that's who we are. It shows our home. It shows our nations. And it shows our connections. And so as we go along, in this presentation, we talk about the Erie Canal. That's what this thing is about. It's genocide against who we are. Straight out white privileged genocide. We were to be extinct according to Clinton. One of them Clintons. He was the governor of New York, or he was the mayor of New York City. But he said in a statement that at the end of this generation, there'll be no more Iroquois seen in this land. He was wrong, but his dream lives on because it comes further from Massachusetts. When Massachusetts claimed to be their state boundaries, went to the Pacific Ocean. Massachusetts state, what they claimed in one of their gatherings of their white privileged decision makers of this land that belongs to Indigenous people, was that if we leave them 10 leagues of land, we can rightfully claim the rest. Yay, 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 they all said in that meeting, and all agreed upon it and passed that along as the teachings that they can rightfully take our land under the name of God. Genocide, an expansion into the forest by white privileged people carries on to this day because the education system don't tell the facts of being content as a human being. That's where it begins, is in the teachings. What you teach your children, they grow up to be. If you teach them the way you want them to be and act, they develop that even better. So it's a never-ending struggle to teach proper human natural law. There's an old TV commercial that says you can't fool Mother Nature. It's so true. So to be at peace in whatever we do as a human race, we must first be at peace with our mother who provides for us. We should always share gratitude with what keeps us healthy. The water. The water that carries you for 9 months before you take a breath of air, that also you should be grateful for each and every day. That water carries you in such a sacred way that you cannot in no way neglect water ever, that you breathe air. In no way do you change its course for any reason. You walk around and you change your path to follow and respect the sacred journey of water. So the destruction of a people's belief was cut right in half and built a water dam right through the heart of our home called the Erie Canal, without even acknowledging the Erie people to use their name. Seneca was one of the first boats that traveled through it. Seneca Chief is what when Phil showed that guy dumping water from one Lake Erie to wherever he went, New York City or Mohawk River, he was riding on the Seneca Chief boat. What I heard. And so when you look at the destruction of the land anywheres, it always has to do with destructing first the water. Our most sacred. Before we're even breathing air. And then the water breaks. And then we feel the soil. And we understand what plant life is about. All our teachings are embedded in who we are. As this is interpreted of the life of a human being to exist with the life of other beings, including our mother, the earth. It's all explained in here. It's all explained in there as to who we are. And we share this information with the newcomers. They come to be lost at sea and find some land and call us Indians. Jumping fast forward a little bit, we can skip 100 years or so. So because these newcomers come to our land, hungry and sick, tired, they get off their boat. When they come into our forest, after they already landed in this area of the Atlantic coast, they come up the Hudson River looking for a route. Must be to find Indians. Anyways, we had noticed that they're going to stay, so we came up with this agreement with them called Turo. It's a wampum belt. It's the foundation of treaty making with the United States and Indigenous peoples. This is the foundation of law that we agreed to. That the Haudenosaunee and their ways and their values and their ideas and their ceremonial and their dress and their languages and their laws will be in one canoe. Colonizers that were coming looking for a trade route and decided to stay will be in their boat right here, and their customs and their ways of life, their songs and their dances and their laws will be in the other row in their boat. And we agreed to travel the river of life side by each without crossing and passing laws onto each other, that we could coexist. Peace, friendship, forever. For as long as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, for as long as water flows downhill, and for as long as the grass grows green, this treaty will be in effect. Thus went up the Hiwagai, and we agreed to that with them. They began violating it. So we had to remind them again what is in the laws of the house that you just made an agreement with to stay. The laws of nature are explained again to them. You only take from the forest what you need. And you always make sure you leave some for the next person who may be in need. It's the one bowl concept of what's in the forest is in there for all of us. What's in that bowl is in there for all of us. And we know from one end of the forest to the other, Seneca Nation, Mohawk Nation, what's in that bowl is in there for all of us. So when we go to gather, whether we're gathering food or medicine, we don't take the first one. We talk to the first one and explain what we're after. We have a connection. We have to teach that connection to what you call the natural world. We're the natural world too. But we have to communicate with each other. And so now we know, because we left the medicine, we left the message with that medicine and what we're gathering. We don't pick that one. We go to the next ones and pick how much we need for the person that we're picking for, who we're gathering for. Same with food, same with animals, same with fish, same with berries. That way you know you're going to leave some for someone else. That way you know that the next fire, which is the next person, because we all have a fire right here. And it's our responsibility to tend to our fire, have a nice, good, strong fire so we can help others. And so when we tend to the foods and the medicines and we acknowledge them and show our gratitude and our sharing and our caring, and we know there's going to be some for others. That brings us to an understanding that we also shared with the newcomers to this land. When I say newcomers, you know who I'm referring to is the colonizers. People lost at sea. Share with them also the one bowl. This is amongst our people. The one bowl concept of knowing that each fire in each nation has a food source if you know you do. Because it's all in there for all of us. It's in that one bowl. If we know we're becoming hungry, then we know they're all becoming hungry. Because what affects one affects all. So when you're having this discussion of independent but united, the matters of the Mohawk Nation stay within the Mohawk Nation. Any matters under council, each one has their own council. The matters of the United Nations stay in their nation because they have their own council fire, just like all of us. Same with Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. But at any time does that go into the other nation in any way, it becomes all of our matter. It becomes a grand council matter. And a runner is sent and summoned all the leaders of all the nations to come together, because whatever was going on in any one of these nations that affected the other one in any way becomes all of us. Just like the food source of the one bowl, one spoon concept. that if one nation is short of food for some reason, it's all of our issues. And we all contribute. Just like forming this belt. Someone didn't just show up with a bunch of beads and say, string this together. They come together. Everybody contributing a little bit of beads, as they're telling what's in there, as they're putting this together and explaining the laws of nature and what Creator had intended. Peace and contentment. There's so much history that's been disrupted by this genocide and canal system of expanding white privilege and claiming more. In order to claim it, because the Massachusetts thing didn't work when they claimed all the way to the Pacific coast because it was unoccupied by whites. So this canal system to open up and establish settlements of white people changes that. That's a violation of law. Your own law. United States' own law. Bill mentioned it a little while ago. The Non-Intercourse Act. It violated Treaty of Canandaigua. Treaty of Canandaigua. Pickering Treaty. George Washington Treaty. We have the original belt that George Washington, the first president of the United States, summoned, commissioned, hired some Oneida people to string together a belt just like this one. When you hear the Thanksgiving address and you hear Skada Handwayam Guatniguhan, we become of one mind. You and I, all of us. We become of one mind to show great gratitude. Kindly and respectfully put our minds together as one. When you look at this, it's interpreted that one of them is the capital of the United States and one of them is the longhouse of the Haudenosaunee. But when you look at it, there's two houses as one. And we're not going to fight each other. And we're going to lock arms and protect. Each one of these representing a colony. 13 colonies. Each one of these ones representing keeper of the western door, the Senecas, keeper of the eastern door, the Mohawks, protecting that longhouse, protecting that White House. We're not going to fight against each other with the United States. And they promised us that they would not take our land. And they did anyways with the Erie Canal. Because what they said and what they did, they speak with forked tongue. Isn't that an old term? Speak with forked tongue. Tell them one thing, tell them another thing. We the people, by the people. There's a message sent to the whole country about the United States forming a new government. They were listening to us. They were listening to the law of the land. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, one of them two guys sent a letter and told England, you better start paying a real sharp ear to what's going on here, because they're talking about forming their own government by the people, for the people. So if that's the case, then it's up to the American people to start righting some of the wrongs that's been done to the Indigenous people. Can't say it's the government doing it, because it's a government for the people, by the people. So it's the people. And another thing, we never gave the United States or the colonies or British, whoever was in charge at different times of this growing new America, we never gave them plenary power over our peoples. We shared that balance with them. We showed them how they can obtain their own state plenary power and governmental plenary power over the states. By this example, that 5 nations can live so far apart from each other, be governed under one government. And this is how you do it. So we shared with them responsibility of a state government and their responsibility to the national government. We showed them their plenary power, but we never gave them ours. We never said, you decide for us what's best for us. We always maintain who we are, and we always will maintain who we are. And we will go by the laws of nature. And so New York State understood this. New York State would accept an invitation wampum, an invitation for a meeting. An invitation wampum is a stick with a string of wampum coming off it. And we hand it to them with the words in it and request a meeting. And then when we show up for the meeting, or they show up for the meeting, they bring it back. And we do the Thanksgiving address. And we brush them down, clear their throats, give them a comfortable seat, give them good, clean water, so their words can come out clear when we meet. So there was this fella by the name of James Duane, or his name was Duane James, told New York State legislation, or the governing body of New York, and the governor, don't do that anymore. Don't let them do their long-winded speeches before meetings. Don't accept that string of wampum from them anymore. And do not treat them like nations, and they will stop acting like nations. This is what he suggested to them, to the state of New York. And the state of New York took his advice and stopped our greetings and stopped accepting wampums and stopped giving back wampums. and start making decisions for us as if we're not a nation anymore. There's a few years that we left out of these discussions, some of the policy makings and how they came about. We're talking about the destruction of our home by a waterway to infiltrate our rooms in our home. And it's a violation of treaty. It's a violation of federal law. It's actually a violation of human rights. Because it's a race acting superior to everything else. And it's up to the people to put a stop to it. And I'd like to suggest something to the Erie Canal itself. Yeah, I'd like to suggest responsibility that they should follow in making sure that every tributary of water that drips into that canal system is pristine enough to drink. Otherwise, keep all humans off that water until it is. That's a responsibility. By building a dam, a water dam through our home comes with responsibility. And if that water's not drinkable, then get off it. Get back onto the land and fix what's dripping into that canal system that you're so proud of. And make it drinkable. Donato.
Thank you so much, Jake. That was a really powerful message that you shared with us all. Does anyone in the chat have any questions that they'd like to ask? I think Derek will be fielding some questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Phil and Jake. Very powerful. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. So Andy Major is interested in hearing more about what happened after, how the Haudenosaunee were affected after the canal was built. Could either of you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. After it was built, and then you had the public, you had the American way, militias and everything to defend the illegal settlers, in which just kept pushing our people further and further away from society, the new societies, the new villages, the new settlements. And now they had reason to form more attacks on us. These wars, the war is still going on. There's many battles that are over, but the war is still going on, and that seems to be our position to fight for protecting the lands, because we now know that these settlers are not going away. So they have a responsibility to protect Mother Earth now. And how it's affected us at that time, shortly after the canal was built, there was diseases traveling through that waterway. Plenty of them. There was syphilises and those kind of diseases. Because every time that expansion went on, it didn't take very long to build. There were like slave workers. There were forced diggers in order to maintain and be accepted as, back in those days, the Italians, the Irish, the different nationalities of immigrants weren't considered white unless they earned that from the American people as to maintaining supremacy. There's a lot of essays been written on it, a lot of scholars been writing on that. And so these people fit right in. When they started these new settlements here, they had to fit right in order to be called white. There's other nations, the other nationalities weren't white until they earned it by acting it. There's a lot of healing that needs to be going on in this country. It's not just amongst Indigenous people, but it's amongst all the immigrants too. They need some healing. And so we'll go on to the next question, I guess.
Right. Well, kind of related to that, I'll kind of combine two questions. What else can be done to reverse the damage done by the Erie Canal, do you think? And you had already talked about the water quality issue. Are there any current discussions with governments around healing the waters?
Yeah, I think that that's a good question from Bonnie and others that are concerned about. So, one of the things that we're talking about, I think we mentioned it earlier, is it's not just about a look at the past history, but it's also about framing what we do for the future. And we have to, it's a very live issue, what it means to improve the Erie Canal, that whole legacy there. There's Derek actually knows more about this, or his boss knows more about this. There are plans afoot on what that's going to look like, what the Erie Canal's next iteration will be looking like. So many of these reflections that Jake has offered us give us a way to think about what's best for the future. I mean, it's not just that. Yeah, we're looking at a regenerative way of thinking about the future. Clean the waters, bring them back to their pristine state. Also, a very live issue in universities all over the country right now is this idea of reparations. And reparations in Evanston, Illinois, for example, is a live issue among African-American communities. But right now, also reparations for Indigenous peoples looks different than that. The return of land, the regeneration of waterways and other elements of our natural world. So I think that we all can have a role in advocating for reparations of various kinds to different communities. So.
I see some pretty good questions there about this one, the canal town on New York wants to end the Erie Canal. And the canal towns that profit from its waterway object to it. Well, when Phil mentioned about the repatriations in Illinois and such, I got this good feeling that anywheres along the Erie Canal that there was profit made, including the Erie Canals, should be repatriating also. They've made profit over an illegal action, and they should be held responsible for it. And then looking down, I see that there's a question about, it must be from the Handsome Lake, Code of Handsome Lake. It must have been because it was mentioned in Phil's. Yeah, that carries on every year. And I don't know if you want to call it a religion, considered a religion. No, it's a reminder. And that Handsome Lake's message reminds us that these people aren't going away, and this is how you should be able to live with them, alongside them, and not forget your own ways. It's a strict reminder of who we are and now what's here amongst us, including alcohol as the number one destructive to the minds of humans. And so it's not considered a religion, but it's become, since the message has been here, spiritual, sacred, and part of us. So if that's what you call religion, we call it a way of life. So it has become a way of life to acknowledge and honor the man who received that message on how we should conduct ourselves living with the new settlers of our lands.
And then we had one other question about the return of Hondashony people who left kind of New York and their relocation and assimilation. Is there anything going on around there?
Well, there is. We live by the clan system, and our clan system is who your mother is who you are. What a mother, matrilineal, and follow that. And we acknowledge the father side clan, but we carry, my mother was the Eel clan. So that's the one that I would carry, is the Eel clan. And so about ceremony to return, they maintained a clan while they were out there, and they don't lose that clan. They bring that back with them. As far as the simulating, though, it's a tough one because we've got so much of the melting pot going on around us. That was its intention, to eliminate us, was to assimilate us and to colonize us. And it's been working, but it hasn't completed its task because we're stubborn and we're not going anywhere.
All right, thank you. One other quick question, which I think I can handle. A teacher, it appears, has asked if the term Iroquois is not advised and Haudenosaunee is preferred. That is correct, right? Yes, I think so. And we had some other questions for the Erie Canal Museum specifically, asking us what our stance is on what you guys have just talked about. I would say, from my viewpoint, at least, is that we really support doing what we can to kind of right the wrongs of the past, and also I think environmental stewardship is important. As Phil discussed, there is a big push within the canal corridor to make the canal much more environmentally friendly. And I think that recognizing these, so this is kind of why we started working with Scano, is to have conversations like this to get us to think more critically about issues with the canal and how it affects all people within New York State, and as well as the nature of it. So I hope that's helpful. We've got one more question. Will the Erie Canal Museum modify your exhibits to include information presented here? We are coming out with a new exhibit this May, Erie Eats, that is going to look at the history specifically of food along the canal, which we're making sure it also reflects Indigenous perspectives as well as that of settlers along the Erie Canal. And I think going forward, we will be much more cognizant of that to answer that question. Are there any other questions? Oh, my director is chiming in our chat. We have also, we are hiring at the moment this is an effort supported by New York State, a fellow for the next 2 years who will be studying specifically the history of marginalized peoples along the canal, as well as we're facilitating, excuse me, I should have brought her on, as well as how the Erie Canal has impacted the environment. So there's the Erie Canals bit. Thank you everyone for watching. Thank you, Jake and Phil, for the wonderful presentation today. It was very insightful, very powerful, and yeah, I hope everyone has a good day for the rest of the day.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I might just offer a personal comment before we depart today, and I just want to say I was really struck by some of the images that Phil shared in his presentation of the conversion of land over time, and I think about what happens to our connection to the natural world when that happens, and also, as Jake mentioned, like our recognition that we too are a part of the natural world. And in discussions with Jake while we were planning this talk, he had mentioned visiting the Erie Canal and you know, listening to the birds and the winds and the smell of the air, and that really resonated with me as a reminder to stay connected to the natural world. And this time of year, I think, is an especially important time to do that, and sort of an easy time because we can see the changes happening. And so probably many of you are out there now with the warm weather we've been having and sort of the smell of the breeze. And I can hear the chorusing of spring peepers outside my window. And so I just want to remind everyone to get outside and to recognize the plants and recognize the animals and just raise your awareness of the gifts that we're given here every day. So thank you again, Nuaha, to Jake, to Phil, to Derek, and Natalie at the Erie Canal Museum. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.